Welcome back to Global Business Report. No fewer than 100,000 youths are to benefit directly from the Nigerian government's $1.1 billion agriculture mechanization scheme, known as the Green Imperative Program. This was disclosed by the Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development, Sabo Nanono, who said an 18-man committee has been inaugurated by the federal government for the implementation of the project. And now, during the inauguration, the minister emphasized the importance of the project, saying there was a great need to prioritize mechanization in the country's agricultural practice. Apart from the youths who would benefit directly, Nanono also said 5 million would benefit indirectly, as the program is designed to enable Nigeria to acquire 10,000 units of tractors and 50,000 units of assorted implements and equipment to be assembled in the country. Now, the Nigerian Customs Service is making plans to go digital once it concludes its automation system by 2022. The announcement came from the Comptroller General of the NCS, retired Colonel Hamed Ali, during the International Customs Day at the NCS headquarters, Abuja. Ali explained that President Muhammadu Buhari had earlier approved the e-customs project for the service. He said that when fully functional, any customs officer who cannot handle the computer will be out of service. Recall that customs had generated a total of 1.341 trillion naira in revenue last year. The amount generated was attributed largely to the land border closure policy of the federal government. And Nigeria needs new growth levers to accelerate economic growth and prosperity in the new decade. Without a change in policy direction, the current low growth cycle is likely to persist. This is according to Afrinvest West Africa Limited in its annual Economic and Financial Market Outlook 2020. The company observed that without fiscal buffers and a flexible exchange rate market, the Nigerian economy recorded its first recession in 25 years in 2016. But the lessons of the past have not been learned, considering sustained energy subsidies, higher wages in the public sector, a rigid foreign exchange market, and delayed reforms. Given the lackluster performance in the latter half of the previous decade, Afrinvest believes the country must implement the necessary reforms to change the course of the economy. Joining me this morning to discuss this report in detail is a Deputy Group Managing Director of Afrinvest West Africa Limited, Mr. Victor Ndukauba. Victor, it's good to have you with us.
It's good to have me. Thank you.
All right. Now, the title of your report is quite interesting, if I may add. What do you form the title of your 2020 outlook, Nigeria in the New Decade? Nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Thank you again for having us. Right. When we set out to review the performance of the economy for 2019, we also thought it was necessary to consider the last decade. And so in going back and reviewing the past 10 years of the country's economic performance, we ultimately looked at it in two halves. The first half being the period between 2009 and 2014, and then the second half being the period between 2015 and now. Incidentally, in looking at the data, what became apparent is that we were essentially looking at two different performances. In the first half, the first 5 years of that review, the country was growing at an average GDP growth of 6.1%, with inflation averaging 10.9%. Unfortunately, in the second half of that decade, growth essentially fell off to about 1.9% on average, while inflation, climbed to 12.9%.
Indeed.
When you look at other metrics in terms of, security, you look at other metrics around healthcare, maternal mortality, it became apparent that we were essentially, making progress in the reverse direction.
Indeed, and you mentioned that Nigeria had a mixed performance in the past decade. What can be done differently for a better performance in this new decade, as it were?
Again, without wanting to sound like a broken record, we believe that there are a number of things that need to be done. Starting first by essentially adopting what is effectively pro-market stance.
Okay.
A good chunk of our economy is driven by trade, very informal. And so we have to embrace trade. So certain actions that appear to be inimical to trade essentially would not be doing us any favors. We have to, consider reforms. We do have a number of subsidies that essentially are robbing the country of resources to invest in more critical infrastructure and more, impactful, spending on human development indices, healthcare, education, and the likes. And those subsidies, we've shouted on the rooftop about them. Talk about energy subsidies, we talk about premium subsidies, subsidies in electricity. So we need to take certain bold policy steps.
Yeah, bold, lukewarm attitude towards the subsidy removal issue, and still lingering.
It's lingering, it's essentially a political decision.
Indeed, it is.
Indeed, but we have to be bold and determinant about it. The reality is there is an energy transition going on in the world. The rest of the world is decidedly against, hydrocarbons and taking very deliberate steps to walk away from that. Unfortunately, we continue to rely on hydrocarbons to be the mainstay of our economy in terms of FX inflows, and that becomes the conduit and the driver for most of the other things that happen. We need to begin to think beyond that and begin to actively prepare as a country for what is a post-oil world.
Very good. Now, let's take a look at some perspective here. Global economic growth slowed to 2.9% in 2019, the weakest since the financial crisis. Is this likely to persist this year? And which factors are likely to drive global growth at this rate?
So global growth slowed essentially on account of a number of headwinds. First, there was the push by the U.S. government, led by President Trump, with the tariff wars and, of course, all of what it did in terms of global trade, slowed global trade down. So we saw what was effectively a coordinated slowdown across most developed economies. That's added on to other, emerging conflicts in the Middle East, the issues between U.S. and Iran, and then there's the Saudi Arabia and the war in Yemen and its impact and its, battle for supremacy with Iran as well. The conflict in Syria, Turkey getting into the fray, and all that has, essentially tempered global growth. However, coming into 2020, it would seem, now that America seems to have sort of sorted out its issues with China, and seems to have resolved that, and also on the cusp of signing agreements with Europe, signing agreements with the North American neighbors, Canada and Mexico. I think the outlook is for more robust growth going into 2020. Growth estimates are about 3.3%, up from 2.9% in 2019. Of course, the key risks to this outlook obviously would be, would Trump follow through on the agreements, or would he rip them up, at some point and then again go back into the trenches?
There's always that question mark.
There's always a question mark.
And you can't help but think that to a large extent, where the world is trying to encourage globalization, but protectionism to a large extent was also encouraged on the part of the United States. Wouldn't you say?
Indeed, protectionism. We saw a wave of protectionism begin to rise, and this followed essentially the political leaning in so many parts of the world. We saw rhetoric begin to shift towards sort of pro-nationalist ideals and political leanings. In Europe, we saw that it begin to rise in several parts of Asia, and those concerns have begun to sort of roll back what is effectively globalization. Although there's a school of thought that argues against globalization as an opportunity for certain developed economies to subjugate others, but again, you cannot extricate politics and economic decision making.
Now let's take a look at that. Since the initial 2020 rally, when oil prices reached $70.3 per barrel due to tensions in the Middle East, as you already alluded to, in the U.S., the killing of the Iranian General Qasem, oil prices has fallen to $59.4. So what's your outlook in prices in 2020 there?
Again, I think I've already talked about what we call the energy transition. There's a shift away from focus on oil. The oil markets these days essentially do not sustain the impact of a rally on account of any sharp disruptions to production. The outlook, broadly speaking, from our perspective, is that oil prices would be sort of moderate and would trade around the sort of $60 threshold. Whenever there is a distortion, we think it will very quickly correct itself. Even though OPEC has committed to essentially maintaining whatever amount of cuts as to help protect prices, unfortunately, the U.S. continues to pump quite a huge volume of shale, and that supply dynamic essentially would mean that oil prices will continue to be sort of moderated.
Very good. Now, on the domestics, in the real GDP growth is yet to recover the pre-recession trend of 6 to 7.0%. So what's your expectation for growth this year?
We saw a modest improvement in 2019. Growth sort of hit the 2.2, 2.25, 2.24 percent threshold.
But that's marginal by all means.
Yeah. So by historical standard, it's poor. When you put that side by side population growth of nearly 3%, it means that we're not growing as fast as our population is growing, and therefore we're actually creating more poor people.
Yeah.
That's what it means, sadly. The expectation or the outlook for 2020 is that growth would improve slightly to about 2.5%, which is not great, but at least suggests that we're heading in the right direction. Now, but the question is that enough? Obviously not. We need to really be doing at least 2 times that number, or 2 times population growth to be making an impact. What steps do we need to take? What actions, policy actions? Again, I think, it's at the risk of sounding like a broken record, we've said this severally. There have to be certain bold initiatives on the fiscal side to support a lot of the activities the central bank is taking on the monetary side. The central bank cannot really do everything because it doesn't have all the levers and the tools required to achieve a high level of growth.
Yeah, still looking at Nigeria, the federal government came up with so many reforms every now and then which will be implemented this year. Looking at the VAT and the possibility of high electricity tariffs, how do you think this will impact the economy? Already we're seeing some grumblings in the public related to these issues. What are your thoughts?
I think there is the concern really is around government revenues, and look at the budget. I was looking at the numbers yesterday. Last year, 2019, the budget was set at about 8.9 trillion. With a revenue estimate of about 7 trillion and the deficit of 1.9 to be funded through borrowings. But when we looked at the actual numbers, revenue came in at, I think, under 5 trillion, 4.8. Yet the government spent about 9.4 trillion with about 4.6 trillion in deficit.
Wow.
It's huge. So I guess that is sort of what informed the actions of the government to increase the VAT levels. The reforms they've done to the sort of deep offshore pricing of oil and the royalty framework. Unfortunately, the negative impact of a higher tax regime is that prices for consumers go up. So consumers will feel the pinch in the pocket. If indeed the proposed upward review in the electricity tariff also takes place, that would impact on the pockets of Nigerians negatively. But having said that, the good thing, although, about the fiscal bill is that it makes certain provisions and exclusions for small and medium-sized businesses. So businesses with revenues of less than 25 million are exempted from VAT. Similarly, medium-sized businesses, lower tax ratios. And I think that's it.
All right, very good, Victor. On that note, Victor Ndukauba, Deputy GMD, Afrinvest West Africa Limited. Always a pleasure to have you. Many thanks for your thoughts on these issues.
Thank you.